Today we're going to deal with a number of topics to help us better understand the dynamics of leadership in an environment where you're going to have to increasingly deal with 3 C's: collaboration, competition, and change. In the old days, in a steady state environment, the person who was in a leadership position, in a supervisory position, could probably rely on a lot of administrative procedures and rules and regulations for supervising and managing. Things didn't change. But when you deal with a changing environment, you can't have a rule and a regulation for everything. And for that, you need more than a manager. You're going to need a leader. So let's start with the first of the C's that you're going to have to deal with in this environment, and that is collaboration. Setting up teams and encouraging people to work with other people. We go, whoops, back up one. Okay, to the overhead. And in this area, what we can learn from emergent leadership tells us something about what's necessary to lead in this collaborative type of environment. Emergent leadership. Here, leaders arise from the group, and their base of power is the followers, the group. That's the area where they get appointed from which they get appointed. They're not appointed from higher up. And so they're not, in a sense, there is not an allegiance to a higher authority. And so it's really this group with which all of the transaction occurs. And since there are so many teams, committees, ad hoc groups, task forces, which operate in organizations today, we look to the area of emergent leadership to tell us something about how do leaders arise from this group? How does the group happen to select a person? Well, whenever you have a group of people, there's always going to be somebody in the group who has some more experience in an area, who has some talents in an area that's more than other people in the group. And so this person will probably be the one who tends to talk out more, and we know that activity leads to being selected as a leader. But we also see some other things happening, and that is the person who emerges as leader, and you can think about the qualities that we talked about last time in terms of personality, the motivation to lead, the energy to lead, the flexibility, the adaptability. This person builds up credits with the group, builds up, if you will, a reputation with the group by being there for the group. In other words, becoming a really reliable team member. There are tasks that the group needs to accomplish. You can always count on this person to step forward and volunteer for a lot of the things that nobody else wants to volunteer for in the group. Already more activity, already setting this person aside. Or you can count on this person to turn to when you need help. And this person is not only willing to help you, but is useful in helping you, has the knowledge and the expertise to transmit. And in so doing, if we flip back to the overhead for a moment, the person builds what are called idiosyncrasy credits. In other words, the group comes to trust this person and is willing to give this person leeway to do things later on when the person wants to take a leadership move that they would not ordinarily give to other members of the group. Idiosyncrasy credits. So now we have one member of the group who's proved himself or herself in the crucible, always being there, trusted. We know this person is reliable. We know this person is capable. And now the motivation to lead, the desire to lead. The person now in a problem situation needs to separate himself, herself from the rest of the group. You can't be a leader and be part of the herd. You have to move apart from that. And so an issue comes up, a problem comes up, and this person has a creative, innovative solution to the situation. And begins to call in the idiosyncrasy credits. Will you support me on this strategy that I want to propose? Will you support me in this business plan that I want to move forward? If necessary, reminding the other individuals that I've been there for you in the past, and I'd like you to be part of my team, and I really think we can do great things. So the person is trusted at this point and is proposing a plan that will hopefully allow the group to achieve its goals. And so the person's plan is adopted, and in so doing, becomes essentially the team leader. And stays in that leadership position as long as, and here's the critical thing and the important thing in all of this, as long as the plan is successful and the person shows competency in helping the group achieve its various goals. And if we look at elected officials, we see that there is this transaction that goes back and forth between the group and whoever is the elected official, and in this case very often it's the legislature that we're talking about. But in a sense that they have to come back to the populace as a whole and get reelected, it's even a greater group. That's where they derive their power from. But they're not going to stay in office unless they achieve goals that are important to individuals. If they don't achieve those goals, as they start to fail, then there is a losing of face and a losing of faith with that individual. You give them some time, but how long do you give that person? Until the group says, time to look for a new leader. The person isn't helping us achieve our goals anymore. So a transaction, you can't have a leader without a group. So this tells us something about the importance of building up credits with the group, of being a good team player prior to becoming a leader, of getting the trust of the people behind you. And it's going to also turn out to be something that ultimately will be helpful to those people who are appointed to leadership positions. They need the trust of individuals, but they also need to successfully lead the group and the unit towards organizational goals. So we learned something in that area. One of the new, well, not so new, I really shouldn't say it's so new, but one of the areas where we can learn from leadership in a different venue. Yet another area that we need to consider, and this deals with another aspect of collaboration, that first C that I talked about, participative leadership. This means involving subordinates in making work-related decisions. Really nothing new in the area of organizational behavior, but it has a new face, a new package, a new label in the management environment. It's called empowerment, a term that you're probably familiar with, and continues to be used, maybe not quite as much and as frequently as a couple years ago, but we still hear about empowerment. And as you work with teams, as you manage teams, the idea here is to move as much responsibility and authority as possible to the team. It should not be threatening to managers, because we're not talking about laissez-faire type of management, uninvolved management, but we're talking about training the team and coaching the team to make decisions that might have formerly been the responsibility of a manager, task assignments, production scheduling, a certain amount of managing each other to make sure, and motivating each other, and training each other, sharing information with each other to make sure that the performance keeps up. The advantage to this type of leadership, something that we've known about in the area of organizational behavior easily going back to the 1950s, so it's not new. It just keeps getting repackaged under a different name, is that as a manager, if you have your workers involved in making decisions, you don't have to closely manage them so much anymore. It frees you up to do other things, to think about strategies, to think about the bigger picture and where you might need to ultimately lead this team, to deal with people who are higher up in the organization and to figure out where you need to strike out into new markets and new products and new services. So that there are clearly advantages to engaging in participative management. And it runs a gamut. It can run the gamut from simply at a very low level of involvement, announcing to your group what the decision is and asking for questions, allowing them to at least have a sense that they have some knowledge about what's going on, even if they don't have a say in the decision, to the very, very engaged and evolved type of participative management, where you actually have self-regulated or autonomous work groups. And that's the work group that's really making a lot of decisions that were formerly managerial types of decisions. Big range in there. And you don't start out right away with a group as a self-regulated or autonomous group. It takes 2 to 3 years to bring a group to that position when you're newly forming a team. It takes a while because they need to gain experience in the jobs and knowledge about the product and knowledge about some of this shared way of operating. I know that, one, I'm going to have to help somebody if somebody requires help, but I also know that as a group, if somebody is engaging in free riding and social loafing, it's also on our shoulders, and this is the tough part, to go to that person and say, hey, you're letting the team down. What's the problem? How can we help you? And you're going to have us all in trouble compared to some other groups that are out there that are competing. Obviously not for everybody. And there's some people who, after a while, want out of this team situation because they find the burden difficult. But there are others who thrive in this kind of situation. So what are the advantages that we see to something like this? Motivation. It helps engage workers. They're more involved in their jobs. You become more involved, your ego is on the line in terms of decisions that are being made. Quality, we hope. Quality, because going back to everything that we said before about group decision making, we hope that we're able to realize some quality in this situation. That bringing multiple heads and knowledge into the situation improves things. And certainly acceptance of decisions. If people have a say in a decision, you've co-opted them, it's hard for them to say, I don't like this, because you say, hey, you had a chance to change this. So it's not likely that you're going to have problems in acceptance once you involve the group in decisions. And when you count on the group for implementing a decision, a change, you better bring them in on the decision because they're the ones who are going to make it happen. Whatever it is, you're making a decision about changing some kind of computer system, they need some kind of say in it because they're the people who are going to be using it. They may not get to choose the system, but let them talk about what they need in terms of specifications, as an example. But there are also disadvantages in all of this, and the disadvantages relate to the time and effort that it takes to get a decision out. Consensus is never easy. It can be a painful process. But when you finish with it, you've got everybody on board. And you know that they're committed to whatever the decision is. For managers who are not used to operating in this environment, what has been tagged command and control, there is a fear about loss of power. If you're the type of management, or if the environment demands that you operate in this command and control situation, the fear is these people aren't going to come through if I let them make the decision, because they lack the knowledge, they lack the skills, and they lack the motivation. But it's your perception of the people. You could change your perception of them, and you could help them gain the skills and the knowledge. Okay, the other side has to deal with the workers themselves. Remember I said that it's not for everybody? And indeed, there are some people who may not be interested in it. There just isn't interest in operating in this group environment. There are always going to be people out there, no matter what you do, you're not going to make work fascinating and engaging and exciting for them. Their fascination is with something else in life. It's not going to be work. I will give you an honest day's work for my wages, but don't involve me with all this empowerment stuff. I don't want any part of it. I just want to come in and work, and I don't want to make the decisions. That's what management is for. That's not what I'm for. And so those kinds of people you're going to have to deal with separately. Still will be good workers, but you're not going to be able to engage them in the teams. They will be in other situations where you don't need teams, and not every piece of work in an organization requires a team. A lot of times you can get by with good coordination, forget the team. However, today's environment often calls for going beyond participation, going beyond the transaction between worker and leaders, to an area that we call transformational leadership. This becomes particularly important as organizations are going through major change. It becomes important as you bring new products, major new products online, and you want the whole organization convinced that this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread. It becomes important when you're re-engineering the whole process and you want people to buy into it. It becomes important when you're downsizing or right-sizing or whatever you're calling it. And not only are you going to have to leave a good part of your organization go, 20%, 30%, who knows what it will be, and that's still happening. Kodak, as an example, is still downsizing to try to deal with the fact that they're not showing the profits that they need to show in order to be successful. You need it when you go through mergers and acquisitions, and we keep seeing in telecommunications all of these attempts to merge various organizations together on a global basis. We went through large waves of mergers, again in the telecommunications area, and I would say news, entertainment, media area. A couple years ago, Disney bought out ABC. CBS was bought by Westinghouse. Time Warner merged with Turner Broadcasting. These are big changes that go on. And when you do those changes, you need yet another aspect to leadership to bring the whole group along and get them to believe that these changes are going to work and make it a better organization, a more durable organization, a more profitable organization. So what kind of leadership do you need? The leadership which provides the followers with a vision. It's the vision thing. And the vision thing works because it instills commitment in the workers. We'll talk in a bit about how you get to the vision thing. So it goes beyond. The transformational leader is going to be marked by this charismatic personality, this ability to engage workers in an almost inspirational way. has that quality to it. So you're not just getting on the team, but this team has, and we hear words that are borrowed from religious life, has a mission to it. And we have places to go. What are the characteristics of transformational leadership? If we can just go back one more time. Individualized consideration, intellectual stimulation, and charisma. I need one volunteer up here, one brave person, so I can do a small demonstration of individualized consideration. Somebody? Kelly? It's not going to be painful. Come on up. No pain at all, and you don't even have to say anything. But the difference between it, from a leader's perspective. And this is something that we've heard that Clinton is really good at. What's the difference between when I shake hands with you like this and say, pleased to meet you, Kelly, and when I go like this and I say, Kelly, I'm really pleased to meet you, okay? Individualized consideration. Okay, you've done your role. As an example of what it is, individualized consideration leaves the person feeling that the leader really cares, is really concerned about me. Politicians are superb at remembering the details of their constituents' lives, names, when they get married, children that they've had, problems that they've talked about. They have this incredible file of facts that they carry in their head, and they're able to attach. When somebody remembers your name, you feel a little bit more important. You're not just the number out there. You're not the anonymous face in the crowd. And so these leaders make that kind of personalized contact with individuals. They know about their work problems, and they stop by to ask them how projects are going and is there some way to be helpful. And they congratulate them on their successes and remember their successes. There is no sparing of pats on the back. And that is extremely attractive to people, because if we go way back to what we know when we talked about what's a strong reinforcement for somebody in learning, remember attention and recognition? Very powerful. And so transformational leaders are superb at doing this sort of thing. And even though they may be on to something else in 2 minutes, for that minute that you're engaged, you feel like you have a place in that leader's memory. You've left a mark, instead of being, as I said before, the anonymous face. The other thing is intellectual stimulation. With the presentation of the vision, you get people excited and thinking about ideas. Presumably, you get them to contribute more of their ideas. That's how the process works. They're willing to open up. It leads the way for innovation. It leads the way for people to think about things in ways they hadn't thought about before. And with the notion of individualized consideration, no longer a fear about speaking out and making the contribution, because there's the belief that my contribution is going to count this time. Somebody is listening to me out there. And so people get excited intellectually, as well as that sense of emotional warmth or bonding or whatever it is to the leader. And then finally, we come to charisma, the most important aspect about transformational leadership. What is the charismatic leader? The elusive, charismatic leader. Well, they are extremely self-confident. Donald Trump, Bill Gates, Lee Iacocca, Bill Clinton. These people are not nervous Nellies about anything that they do. They are confident in the approaches that they take to things. And they like to lead. They like to be dominant in a situation. The motivation, the flexibility, the drive to lead. And they have a conviction that what they're doing is right. That makes such a difference in leadership because you can sell what you're doing much more convincingly when you believe it's right. For anybody who's ever engaged in sales or contemplating going into sales, I would say the prime thing is belief in the product you're selling. You've got to believe it's the best product, because then you can really convincingly sell it to someone else. That's step number one. Step number one is selling yourself and making sure of it. And once you've gotten past that, then it's so much easier to try to convince somebody else. If you have self-doubts about anything that you're engaging in, that's going to show. And people will pick up on the self-doubts about the program, the product, the change that's happening. And they'll say, well, if the leader is wondering about it, I should wonder so much more. What are the problems? What's the hidden agenda that I don't know about? And so, very important, and charismatic leaders indeed believe in these kinds of things. What else can we say about charismatic leaders? They simultaneously have high expectations for the group, along with strong beliefs that the group can meet those expectations. And that sets high goals, if you remember what we talked about goal setting, setting difficult goals, and simultaneously coaching and encouraging and spurring the group on to higher levels than they ever thought they were capable of doing. You can do it. It might mean that you're going to have to go out and practice a whole lot harder. It might mean you're going to have to give up your date on the golf course and go into the weight training room. But now, the desire to achieve becomes so much more important to the individual that it's easy to give up the golf date. In the big picture, that doesn't mean anything. It's easier to do the off-season training. It's easier to make all the extra phone calls that you need to make in terms of setting up contacts for selling the product. It's easier to work after hours because you want this to succeed. Now you believe in the whole thing, okay? And you want to carry out the expectations of this leader whom you want to think well of you. Now it's important for the leader to think well of you. And you're going to carry that out. So you begin to see ties between a lot of the things we've talked about during the course of the semester and this thing called transformational leadership. What is it that they do? What are the stages that they engage in as they're moving the organization through the transformation, through the merger, through the new product that's rolling out, through downsizing, through re-engineering, through reorganization? What's going on? And how does this link back to a lot of the things that we've talked about? Well, first the leader has to carefully assess the need for change in the various people in the organization and the need for change in the organization. One of the things we talked about last time was having cognitive abilities, analytical abilities on the part of the leader, and this is where it comes in. You need to, at this point, be able to assess what the abilities of your workers are. You need to be able to assess what their knowledge is. You need to be able to assess what their motivational levels are, their readiness, and what their needs are going to be in all of this. You need those analytical skills. You need to think a bit about what's going to motivate these people so that as you present the change program, you can feed into their needs, and they will see that their own goals ultimately get realized by participating in all of this. The second stage is formulating a vision. We have heard so much about the vision thing. What is it about the vision thing that works? Well, first of all, go back to what we know about goal setting. It clearly articulates what the goals are for the individual. Now they know where the organization wants to move. But in articulating the goals of the organization and where it wants to move, you need to do yet another thing. You need to present with it a compelling reason for going there, what's going to be achieved at the end, the rainbow, the pot of gold that will be there. And to get people to remember these things, use anecdotes as a way of getting there. Use success stories of other organizations, use success stories of people. What this does, if you go back to what we talked about in terms of decision making and the availability heuristic, is people will hang on to these anecdotes much easier than that stack of statistics that you might throw at them and say, look, I've done all of these analyses and this is what my projections are. That's not going to get people excited, and they're not going to remember those kinds of things. But they will remember the anecdotes and they will remember the stories that you tell. And people who are transformational leaders know how to do this. Successful politicians are transformational leaders, and they will get up there and they will tell you stories about various constituents and what their programs have done on an individual basis for various constituents. Or think about the charismatic religious leaders who will tell you about how people have been healed. But they don't present statistics and say 95% of the people who've done what I've suggested have been healed, but they work on individual stories that people remember to capture people and bring them in. So this is what the vision does for people. It is a way of articulating goals and showing people where things are going, and it's a way of motivating them. The second, the last stage, talks about getting subordinates to carry out the mission. Now you've got to implement this whole thing. And one of the ways that you're able to engage the energy of the masses is to set an example, leading by example. In order to get this project done, we're going to have to stay up all night long and sleep in the office. You've got to be the first one to stay up all night long and sleep in the office. You've got to be the first person there and the last one to leave, to show the commitment of your workers of how important it is to put the effort into this project. You do it by demonstrating self-sacrifice, and you do it by demonstrating extraordinary expertise and knowledge. And this also gets people to believe. If you remember what we talked about in terms of social learning, the role model, you are, as the leader, #1 role model. Don't ever expect your people to behave in a way that you're not prepared to behave in yourself. If the project requires extraordinary effort, but you can't get yourself into the office before 10 o'clock in the morning, you might initially get people who are willing to come in early, but they're going to look around and see your behavior as setting the limits for their own behavior. They're not going to show up. And so the need to show these dramatic examples, again, is a way of motivating and inspiring people on the one hand, and showing them what's needed in terms of their own behavior in order to get the project rolling. So it involves coaching people, it involves stroking people, it involves having high expectations for people. All of these kinds of things transpire and come together in the charismatic leader. We don't have a lot of them. And the interesting thing is, even though we've analyzed it, we haven't figured out a way to really train people to become charismatic leaders. somehow they bring these traits to the table. It may be because people tend to see themselves as being shy, even in managerial leadership positions, and are uncomfortable with this individual consideration bit that I talked about. It seems hokey. It may seem almost unmanagerial and unprofessional to do these kinds of things. And yet we know the effect of doing these kinds of things. And so it may be that this style, this charismatic style, even though necessary at some points, will be constrained by the organization you work in that frowns upon that sort of thing and is not going to let it transpire. So we just don't have many charismatic leaders out there, but there are some that are there, and they are indeed, we know they are successful. A warning before we leave talking about charismatic leadership, and that is, in building it, the loyalty of the subordinates really attaches to whoever the leader is or the manager. And you have to be very careful in this situation not to abuse or exploit the loyalty and trust that they give you, because it does become easy in that kind of situation. And you have to make sure that you keep in mind the ease of abusing this, and you don't ask people to do things that are really unreasonable in the situation, really unreasonable, because they will try to do it, perhaps at harm to themselves. Playing when you are really hurt, not a smart idea, because you get hurt even more in the process. Some players try to do it, and in the process, to suppress the pain, take all kinds of drugs. Okay, it can become easy to exploit that kind of situation. I give you that as an example. And you have to ensure in all of this that the loyalty that you have for your followers is used to obtain organizational and group goals and not personal goals. Do you derive personal goals out of this? Sure. It must feel great to have the admiration of a group of people around you. But that is tangential to what's really going on. And you need to keep that focus in mind too. So, a bit of warning on this. And yet another topic that we talk about in a changing environment, and that is gender in leadership style. Women have always had leadership roles, but not as frequently that we know of as men. And often in years past, they were appointed to those positions. The queens, Elizabeth I and II, Catherine the Great. But there were others that rose to positions of prominence in great leadership and transformational leadership. We hear of Joan of Arc, we hear of Florence Nightingale. And more recently, Eleanor Roosevelt, as an example of someone who, a woman in a leadership position. And if we come up to today, there are many women in leadership positions in politics in the state of New Jersey. Christy Whitman. Women who are senators, women who are representatives in Congress, women who are heads of state in other countries. We have not yet had a woman head of state, but it's happened a long time ago in other countries. In India, there have been a couple already. In Israel, there have been some. Norway. So it's happened already. Do these women act any differently once they get to the position of power than men do? Or once they're there, is it the situation that pushes them to behave in certain ways and they're constrained? If we listen to the early information coming out about women as leaders when the studies first started on them, we heard much about women as a different type of leader. They were going to be more humane. They were not going to be the command and control leaders. Let me ask in the class, and again, we talked about this a little ahead of time, some of you have had experience with women as managers. Kelly, you said that's been your sole experience. You want to tell us a little bit?
Well, the managers I've had, you know, they were, of course, all women, and they were understanding. They weren't as rigid and tough as I think a man would be, but they were effective because you respected that and you did your work, and you know, it was just a respect level that you have for them, so you didn't kind of feel like you can get away with things just because they weren't as rigid and as tough and aggressive, maybe, as a man would.
So they demanded results from you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They demanded results, but they went about it in a way where, you know, they weren't like yelling at you and demanding you do this, you do that, but they did it in such a way where, you know, you knew where they were coming from.
Okay, so you think that there was you imagine there's a different style about them. Daniel, you said you've worked for men, for women. You want to talk a little bit about that?
The female managers that I've had experience with, I've seen them blow off the handle. Basically, I mean, to put it in a nice way. Not personally at myself, you know, 'cause I don't give them a reason to, but I've seen how they interact with other workers who are not up to par, and it's just they're very volatile, I think.
Emotional, is that the word you might want to use?
Okay, I was trying to stay away from that one, but
yeah.
you know, with male managers, I've noticed a more calm, even when they're dealing with problems and people not following their directions, and it just seemed calm the way they did things.
Let me toss one question out to the class, taking a risk here. Has anyone here ever been chewed out at work? John, has it happened to you?
Well, I went to a field training when I was in, like a couple summers ago for the Air Force, and my flight training officer was a woman.
Yeah?
Yeah, so it was a high, intense situation and stuff, so.
And you were
chewed out a couple times.
Chewed out. Have you ever seen men chew out individuals as well?
Sure.
So do you think they were acting any differently? In the
I think the differences you see are, there's a lot of different styles of women leaders. So some women leaders will handle situations one way, some women leaders will handle situations another way.
Okay.
So.
Do you think you see the same variety in men? Okay. So a little bit of your experience about it. Let's see how this jives with what some of the research has shown in terms of leadership. The literature has shown that there are some different expectations held for men and women leaders. And maybe it kind of violates our expectations or our images of what women should be like when we see them acting in aggressive, directive kinds of ways, and that surprises us. We're not expecting it, that we would tolerate that more in a man. We'd be more accepting of it, at least initially, in a man than we would of a woman. Those are some of the, you know, there are some different expectations that seem to be there. One of the small pieces of research shows that women who wear business types of suits, sort of a more masculine type of dress, are judged to be more powerful than women who come in brightly colored dresses. So our expectations, our images of what power is, tends to be more masculine. As a matter of fact, again, the early research said that if you described what are the traits that you think you need to be a successful manager, and then you ask people to describe what do you think the typical man is like, what do you think the typical woman is like, it was a closer match between typical man and successful manager than typical woman and successful manager. Okay, so again, it shows you that at least initially when all of this started out, there were some different expectations. But we're talking about the 1970s, and we've got 25 years plus of experience with that. And reviews of the literature now tell us something different, that when men and women evaluate the leaders' behaviors, there's really no significant differences they see in the way that they behave. That women demand results, that women are concerned with getting tasks done and scheduling, and that men are concerned with seeing that conflict doesn't arise in the group. So both sides, both men and women, engage in the directive production types of behaviors, the production orientation, and as necessary in the people orientation. But what has emerged consistently, very consistently, whether the research is a laboratory type study or whether it's out in the field in a real organization, is that indeed women do use different styles. They are consistently more participative or democratic in style than men are. They're less likely to be directive. They're more likely to weave what one woman called the web of inclusion. They're more likely to engage in walk-around management, going into offices and see what's happening, and asking opinions, and getting things done. So they get the job done as much as a man gets it done, but they do it in a somewhat different way. And the question that you want to ask is, why do women engage in this participative style? Across the board, regardless of types of organizations even. I might say, well, one reason is, well, women were socialized from the beginning to be more in tune with people's feelings and needs to be included, the whole need to be maternal in terms of raising children, and children can't tell you how they feel, so you have to kind of guess at what they feel and be really concerned with it. And we socialize women along those dimensions, and we don't do so much with the guys, with men. That's one example. Or the other says that because women are still relatively new in leadership roles and relatively less accepted, we know that by using participation, you're more likely to get your ideas accepted, and you want the team in back of you, and you want the team to trust you. And this is particularly true where you move into areas where women have not traditionally participated, and I'm talking about construction and transportation and manufacturing, and we now have women who are in transportation. You can get on a bus and see a woman driving a bus, as an example. We know women now are pilots and flying planes, so they're in that area. We know that women are in construction. Some of them own their own construction firms, and it's clearly moving into a non-traditional area and trying to gain the trust of workers who just haven't been used to working for a woman who's out there with her hard hat on directing the construction project or on top of a piece of heavy equipment and moving it, or in manufacturing. But they're making headway there. And so maybe this is the way they build the trust of the workers, is to use participative leadership. One very, very interesting piece of research that I have to relate before we move off this, which suggests yet another reason. And it goes back to this notion of different expectations for male leaders and female leaders. One of this studies was done by Butler and Geis, where they were recording not only people's verbal reactions to male and female leaders, it was an experimental situation, but their nonverbals as well. And what they found is that when women acted in this assertive, directive manner, even though they got the same paper and pencil evaluation and satisfaction as men in that, they were getting really differences in nonverbal responses. They were, unbeknownst to the group, videotaping it so they could go back and analyze it later. On the nonverbal level, women who were acting in this assertive, directive type of manner were picking up a whole lot more frowns and scowls and grimaces and shaking the head no, as opposed to the expressions of acceptance, which the men were getting much more frequently of, oh yeah, understand that and I'm with you. And so that may also suggest to women that the way that they succeed in a group and they get accepted is to, again, act in this participative way. But women indeed have come a long way, and they are breaking through the glass ceiling. So where does this leave us with dealing with all of this? You sort of flipped through this one. Does leadership matter? We've spent 2 sessions talking about the importance of leadership. And it seems as if it should matter in an organization, and that organizations that have good leadership are going to be more successful than those that aren't. And I spent a lot of time talking about the bad boss problem and how that can detract from success in an organization. If an organization were perfectly designed and it functioned perfectly, you wouldn't need a leader. But because of change that goes on, because there's not a rule and a regulation for everything, you need people to take decisive actions. And so you do need leaders. So leaders matter in situations where you don't have a rule to spell out things. Leaders matter where you need them to spearhead change and implement change. And you need leaders to deal with the various variations that exist out there among workers. You can't program things and deal with every situation individually. However, their influence is circumscribed, and there may be times when you want to think about, if we're not having good leadership, can we have a substitute for leadership? Is there some way to neutralize bad leadership when we don't have it? And some research tells us, indeed, yes. If you have some characteristics in your subordinates, then certain things in your leader are superfluous. If you have subordinates that are knowledgeable, that are well-trained, then you don't need the leader to do the training. You don't need that production orientation. That's a substitute for it. If you have workers that have a professional orientation, they're already motivated because they bring this professional orientation to the situation, then you can deal less with the people orientation. You don't need that as much to do that involvement kind of thing, that individualized consideration, nor do you need to do the directive type of motivation. You have a substitute there as well. And if you have people who are not particularly indifferent to, who are indifferent to the rewards, if they're not interested in the rewards of the organization, then the power of the leader is neutralized. It's not going to work. What about task characteristics? That also can act as a substitute. If the tasks are routine and clear, again, you don't need the directiveness. If the task provides its own feedback, you don't need the leader to provide the feedback. And if it's intrinsically satisfying, again, you don't need the person orientation. And there are organizational characteristics which substitute as well. The cohesive work group can motivate people, and formalization of work rules can provide for a leader who is not up on things. So there are lots of things that you can get away with for a while in the organization, but not for too long, because the group isn't going to want to carry the leader for too long. Feelings of inequity set in. So where does this leave us? We've looked at idiosyncrasy credits. We've looked at participative leadership. We've considered whether leadership really matters. And in situations, it clearly does, but you can get by in some situations without it. Next time, we look at the organization as a whole, starting with structure.